Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on the time zone that you might be tuning in from today. I'm your host and moderator for the session that we have lined up, Unmasking Sanctions Evasion, Trends, Challenges, and Solutions. Before I turn it over to our esteemed panel for some quick introductions, just wanted to give the audience a couple of announcements. First is we want your participation. So if you have a question, 5 minutes in, 10 minutes in, 25 minutes in, use the Q&A box, click ask question, send the question in, and we'll go ahead and pose those questions to our panel. As a reminder, use the Q&A box. If you need to ask a question about, a phone number, a different way to access the session today, use the chat function for that. So we really want to have people use Q&A for actual questions for our panel. I also want to thank the team at Socure. They've been a longtime partner of ours, so thank you for the continued support. Thank you to our panelists, who you'll hear from in just a second. And as always, thank you to our audience. We can't do sessions like this without a viewing audience, so thank you very much for coming back to another great session. With that being said, let me turn it over to our panelists for some introductions. Deb, let me start with you. If you could tell the audience a little bit about you and your role at Socure.
Sure. Thank you very much, Todd. My name is Deb Geister. I am the VP of Compliance Solutions for Socure. And in that role, I make sure that our products are aligned with compliance and regulatory requirements, as well as supporting our clients to be able to assure that their policies and procedures are aligned with our products. My background is a former BSA officer, and also I've spent many years in the data business. So glad to join you today.
All right. Thank you. Clint.
Hi, my name is Clint Hayworth. I'm the Director of Compliance at Alloy. Here at Alloy, I work with our product teams. I sit inside the legal and compliance department, making sure that we provide a variety of support to both our internal stakeholders and our external partners, customers with training, refining products. I have a long-time experience in consumer financial services as a lawyer and as a chief compliance officer at different organizations.
All right, and Josh.
Hey, everybody. Josh Fruth, good to be here and happy to work with industry and our FinTech AML community. So I'm with Section 2. Right now, I'm working as a consultant for the U.S. government. Previously worked as the Director of Counter-Threat Finance at NATO Special Operations, as well as Director of AML Advisory Services at New Jersey-based Matrix IFS. I have worked in the counter-threat finance community for a number of years within the interagency. As an Army intelligence officer, I've been assigned to DEA, U.S. Special Operations. I was the DoD lead at the Department of Commerce, and also did assignments with the National Counterterrorism Center and National Counterintelligence and Security Center. So most of my career has been focused on the government side of this. I'm a FinCEN certified analyst, but I've also worked in the financial services department as well. And big shout out to Deb Geister, since she's on the line today. Deb, in my opinion, is one of the world's top financial crime experts. So it's an honor to be on with her today. And thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thank you, Josh. And thank you to Deb and Clint as well for those intros. And Deb, speaking of Deb, we'll start with you. If you could maybe just set the scene for the audience, those who might either be viewing live or who might watch this on replay. Why are we talking about sanctions, and why is it important for everyone to understand sanctions and what we're talking about versus, a fintech or a bank? Explain why it's important to everyone.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, Todd. Currently, because of geopolitical events, right, sanctions is something that's been a very active and very dynamic environment. It's not that OFAC is new, right? It's been around for many decades. So this is not, many of you are familiar with OFAC, but in this current environment, because of things like the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, sanctions are a tool that's been engaged. And so we're seeing full blocking sanctions on significant financial institutions, political elite and family members, being sanctioned, as well as entities and ownership of entities. There's restrictions on import of technology goods and export controls on things like oil refining. So there are a number of things that are going on. And where we typically see maybe once a week change on the OFAC list. We're currently seeing 2 to 3 times a week now that the list is changing. And add that on top of the fact that the United Kingdom, European Union, a lot of other countries are applying sanctions across the board. There's a lot going on. So there's a lot at stake to be able to manage sanctions. For those of you that have been in this world for a long time, it goes without saying, but I still have conversations with organizations that believe that sanctions specifically are only an issue for financial institutions, but that's really not true. The OFAC laws really say that we can't do business. If you do business in the US, you can't do business with anybody that's on the OFAC list. They're considered enemies of state. And so we cannot do business with those no matter who you are or what type of business you're in. OFAC is one of those things that we have to deal with. So when you look at kind of from a policy perspective, you see a lot of influence here that is input into OFAC. OFAC is kind of the governing body or the overarching organization that really administers and manages that overall policy on the lists. But there is a lot of input from the White House, from the Treasury Department, from other parts of the government, as I'm sure Josh will tell you. So I think this, because of our geopolitical state, is why we're talking about sanctions today. And it's not just about checking a box or checking a name on a list. I think there's a lot more to it that we'll talk about.
Thank you, Deb. And Josh, I want to pivot to you. Obviously, Deb gave a really good overview of what to what we should be focused on here in today's session. I'd love to hear your real world experience and kind of some examples and background of what is good for the audience to hear and understand about OFAC and sanctions.
Thank you, and agree with everything Deb said there. Look, at the end of the day, the number one thing I like to talk about with industry when we talk about sanctions is there's a deliberative difference between watchless filtering, the type of screening that you all do within the banks, versus sanctions evasion. So I want to be clear in stating that sanctions evasion is a transaction monitoring function, not a screening function. And in order to be able to screen for these types of things that we're going to talk about today, and it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose, it requires a substantial amount of knowledge of current affairs, of international business, economic statecraft. There are echelons to this AML game. And somebody that's at Deborah's level, for example, is like a 10. But there are many, many subsequent echelons within that sphere. And to be able to understand the international affairs impacts of it, some of the current events that we're going to talk about, and then to quantify that into data, into transaction monitoring models that are actually going to fire in an FIU and actually generate alerts. That's where we need to get to. And I just like to say this, when we're talking about sanctions evasion, we are talking about hostile, near peer state adversaries to the United States. We're talking about Russia, we're talking about China, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about North Korea. So this is a huge distinction from the games that I came from and that many of you came from when we were working, financial facilitation and money laundering with gangs, with terrorist organizations, with drug cartels. When you're talking about a hostile state actor, the scope and the scale of the funds that they need to launder for things like currency cleansing, for example, we have that in the list here, organized currency cleansing, or to facilitate corruption on a global scale. Deb hit it on the head when she was talking about not just sanctions, but export enforcement controls. The Department of Commerce is a key player today. We have our adversaries like Russia and China attempting to procure advanced semiconductor and microcomponent technology, emerging tech, oil, weapons, all sorts of different things that have dual military end use, aviation, for example. So the stakes are much higher. And if a financial institution is found to have not been compliant, not found these things, my experience with these regulators is that they are outcome focused. So they are looking for outcomes. If a multi-billion-dollar sanctions evasion scheme happens within your financial institution, that is an outcome. That is a failure. So we want to be situationally aware of the world we live in and the threat landscape that we face specifically with near peer state adversaries. And we want to be able to think outside the box when building our organizational risk profile and find a way to quantify that within our transaction monitoring models. And I know that's broad, but we're going to try to dive into it a little bit. Next slide. So just one more thing, kind of the background, because most of, and this is not slide specific here, folks, most of the conversation today, at least that I'm going to share with you, is going to be Russia specific. And the reason it's going to be Russia specific today is because Russia invaded Ukraine. So we have a brand new sanctions regime focused on Russia. We obviously had 2014, some sanctions focused on the Crimea annexation, but this is very different. This is like full-on sanctions warfare, full-on commerce, BIS or Bureau of Industry and Security warfare. But just because we're going to be talking about Russia today, folks, I want your minds and your planning process to be on China. Right now, our focus is on Russia. And of course, to a large extent, from a commerce perspective, the export enforcement controls are substantial towards the Chinese Communist Party. But I want to make no mistake here. We are headed towards a major armed conflict with China in the Taiwan Strait. That is the direction things are going. That is what the U.S. interagency is preparing for. And that will affect the financial services industry. It will affect what your regulators are looking for, and it will affect the priorities that you have. We are transitioning from a non-state actor emphasis, terrorist groups, cartels, to an overwhelming emphasis on what we would call the great power competition, which is really predominantly focused on China and Russia. So while I'll be talking about Russia today, my advice for you is SAR generously when it comes to anything CCP related, anything China focused, particularly related to some of the industries that we're going to talk about today. Now, getting into kind of the commerce piece of this. This is when we transition from, like I said, a non-state actor AML environment where we're focused on countering terrorism finance to a hostile state actor like Russia. We're looking at a state actor that is attempting to procure all of the items that it needs from an operational sustainment perspective to sustain its warfighting capabilities. And when we're looking at sanctions, you all have to be going through the consolidated screening list. You need to be looking at companies that are listed. You need to be looking at industries that are listed. When we deal with Russia and China, just because a company is not listed on the consolidated screening list and Commerce BIS has not banned them, does not mean that by virtue of industry that they are not going through a complex corporate structure of front and shell companies. So you lean on common sense, lean on your spidey sense in that domain. Specifically, the semiconductor industry is hot right now. It doesn't matter if it's Russia or China. And the Chips and Science Act has been incredibly successful. Anything that you see that is emerging tech focused, whether it's semiconductors, aviation, AI, anything like that that touches Russia and China, the hair on your neck should be raising up right now, because certainly from the public sector purview, it is. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example. I don't expect you to memorize this, but when I talk about the sophistication of a scheme by a state actor versus a non-state actor, this is multi-tiered. It touches multiple functional and multiple geographic lines of effort. So, for example, in this case, we have a front company that's associated with Russian intelligence that is flagged by Germany. This is a German company, but it's really Russian intelligence. They are involved in a scheme where they're essentially procuring Venezuelan oil, which in violation of U.S. and EU sanctions. They are then going through a process where they're essentially utilizing false invoicing, trade-based money laundering, false invoicing, and methods to evade KYC. So we have digital signature and identity issues here. And then they're essentially laundering those funds. And in tandem with doing that, they're cleaning out the Russian ruble into the dollar, the sterling pound, the euro, and they're then using that through front companies to procure U.S. source technologies that go into everything from their fighter jets to their missile and air defense artillery capabilities to radar and satellites. So, for example, we had very successful interdiction efforts in the semiconductor space, to the point that Russia was trying to pull semiconductors from tractors to put into conventional weapon systems. That's what I call an effect. So this is an example of what right looked like from their perspective when it worked for them. We see that we have ties to Oleg Deripaska here, which I like to say is the real world James Bond villain. He's probably the most dangerous person in my perspective in Russia because he's the smartest, and we're going to talk about him shortly. But essentially here, what we have, and I don't expect you to remember this again, we have oil mixed with a lot of KYC issues, bulk cash drops, trade-based money laundering issues that involved everything from the maritime ports to the bills of lading and shipping documents, cryptocurrency, and correspondent banks. So think about, depending on where you sit within that flow chart, could this scheme have touched your institution? The chances are probably yes. And next slide, please. Okay, so I know mirror trading, but I am nowhere near the expert on it that Deb is. So Deb, I'm going to let you take Deutsche, and I'll jump in at Dansky.
Yeah, I think it's just one thing to be aware of. What we saw with the Deutsche case was that there was Russian dollars that were being transferred, and they were transferred across different operating units for Deutsche Bank. But the key thing that helped us detect those was what we call mirror trades. So it was exactly the same dollar amount in every trade as it kind of hopped across different continents. So when you see patterns like that, that's one of the typologies that we typically look for in sanctions evasions, to say, hey, this is something that is unusual. That's not usually the way trades work. And so it's something, when you're doing detection, if you are in the investments space, something to be aware of and to look for.
Thanks, Deb. And I want to hit on this Dansky Bank thing. I know that it's recent, but the old saying is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And what we tend to see, both with hostile state and non-state actors, is they're able to get away with certain schemes successfully, and they repeat. Sometimes they'll change their SOPs, but oftentimes they'll repeat. Now, the Dansky Bank situation in 2019, for those that don't really understand what happened, you had one branch of Dansky Bank in Estonia, two people on the inside that were essentially facilitating $20 million US dollar equivalent in Russian ruble currency cleansing each day. This went on for years. Over 6,000 accounts were involved, numerous shells that many of them shared the same address in the UK. So anybody that works in the AML field, whether you're an investigator or you deal with big data and you're looking at attributes in terms of transaction monitoring development, anybody can see the elements of this that are like common, right? That we would normally look for. But the funds were tied to Putin's family members, tied to his cousin. Now, to me, I take this, I always tell you, remember why we do this, the human cost of this. This is in 2019. Everybody on this call has seen the tremendous human suffering that's happened in Ukraine in the last year. Tremendous human suffering. I don't have to say it. We're all intelligent, educated people that watch the news. Everybody knows what's going on here. This case funded that conflict. Don't be a part of the bank that does that. Moving on to the real estate piece. Again, we're dealing with Russian intel here, where we had a tie to specific PEPs, 7-charge indictment for fraud and money laundering. It was real estate that was the financial facilitation apparatus with shell companies and brokerage accounts. Again, with the Russians, we come back to a lot of brokerage accounts. We see a lot of equity trading, a lot of things that touch international correspondent banking, and a lot of things that touch, I think I said securities, but real estate, of course. And this is a case where we had attempted election interference just in the 2020 election. And I believe that was Deripaska line, Deb, but I can't remember. So yeah, this is common practice. Florida and New York are big states for this. So if you see Russian naming conventions associated with real estate in the state of Florida, I mean, I always tell people, look, there's a big difference between something that is based in hatred, ethnocentrism, racism, things like that. There's a big difference between that and understanding the risk factors that we see, like such as naming conventions, such as geography, such as fund flows, such as types of business. So I am not proposing something based in ignorance, but I'm saying if you see Russian naming conventions associated with certain businesses in certain places, it should be something that you're at least looking for. 2023, we're talking lax controls, okay? This is not as common these days. The smaller fines that we find FIs getting hit for lax controls, the big ones have some meat to them. But in 2023, March of 2023, Russia evaded sanctions to launder. This was the grain issue. So we see them touching every hot industry. Of course, the grain that comes from Ukraine and Russia is significant to feeding people throughout the African continent and all over the world for that matter. And we saw British digital financial institutions with shelves lined up in this. So another key hub in what we would call kind of the Russia sanctions evasion hub and spoke model is London. Next slide, please. Okay, so story time. I know everybody loves my stories. So when we talk about the kind of big strategic picture of Russia, from fall of the wall, post-Soviet Union to now, what we're essentially dealing with today is what I would call a communist-esque oligarchy. They are still communist-like. At the fall of the wall, you essentially had the communist privatization, where all of the government businesses were sold off to people, and every Russian citizen got a voucher that they could use to buy into business. The reality is, all of what we would call the Bratva, or the mafia brotherhood, basically took all of these vouchers from people, and they used a bunch of Spetsnaz and former KGB guys to cordon off areas where the sales of these companies happen. So it would be like the 5 mafia families of yesteryear in the United States buying Microsoft and Tesla and et cetera, like all the big American businesses. That's exactly what happened in Russia. Now, those people that we would call oligarchs, those former mafia bosses, they have become the oligarch, industrialists of today. And they're part of what we call the Siloviki, which is basically the inner circle. Now, that inner circle has traditionally been built around Putin. It includes not only the oligarchs, which are super wealthy and mainly tied into the energy, so i.e. oil, natural gas, and precious metals like aluminum and nickel trades, but they're also the bureaucrats, the intelligence community leaders, et cetera. They found refuge after the wall fell in Cyprus. And basically Cyprus, I've had the slide up for a while, so I think you all have had a chance to probably read through it. They were buying up their yachts. It was kind of their party area. They called it the playground of the gods, and Moscow in the Med. But basically, they had a golden passport system where if you had money and you were a criminal or an oligarch or whatever, you could get that passport. Cyprus has worked on kind of pushing against this Russia thing a little bit, but they are still a major hub. And China is a major hub. China and Iran are supporting the Russia war effort in Ukraine, and that includes not just product, but financial facilitation. So China's heavily involved. Dubai is a huge hub as well. So just think, if you start seeing transactional nexus that include multiple major hubs within this Russia hub and spoke model of sanctions evasion, that's something that should make your spidey senses raise up. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've been studying Oleg Deripaska for over 20 years. This is not a politically partisan thing. Deripaska has went after both Republicans and Democrats in the United States. And I am not a politically partisan person. I'm not going to come at you with that today. But from a targeting perspective, there appears to be a distinction between Russian intelligence targeting efforts and Chinese intelligence targeting efforts in the United States. The Chinese typically seem to target the Democratic Party for exploitation, and the Russians typically seem to target the Republican Party. Oleg Deripaska was a person that was very successful at doing that. He had Paul Manafort, who worked for Trump, on his payroll. He also had relationships with Bob Dole and others. Like I said, I've been studying Deripaska for 20 years. He is a true James Bond villain. There's a story about him that he basically skied down a mountain after the wall fell, while getting shot at by machine guns and RPGs, jumped into a helicopter and flew away. And the reason that had happened is he was fleeing one of his factories after it was raided, after he had all the other metals barons assassinated in a single day. And that's why he is known as the main metals oligarch. Deripaska controls the world's controlling interest of both aluminum and nickel. He bought up the major auto manufacturers in Russia, Gaz and Magna International. And at one point, Magna International was the lead bidder to buy the Chrysler Group, one of the American big three, from Daimler-Benz during the financial crisis in the late 2000s. This guy has his fingers in everything. Really, really has his fingers in everything. Real estate in the United States and in London. He's got ties into election interference. He has ties into just a number of different things. So EN Plus is his main company that he's been involved in. But this is just a main oligarch to study. It's a very interesting person to study. If you want to learn more about this problem set, you will learn more about Russian sanctions evasion as a whole just by studying this figure. And I just kind of wanted to introduce him, but I'm happy to answer more questions as we go. Next slide, please. So, all right. So these are just kind of some interesting things that Deripaska has been involved in. We talked about the sanctions evasion. He has also been involved in the procurement scheme. We talked about that German front company that was essentially buying Venezuelan oil, selling it, cleaning the currency, buying U.S. sourced military dual end use and emerging tech items that then made their way into the Russian warfighting chest. This is the man that did that. So everybody knows about Prigozhin. He's the guy that leads the Wagner group, which is like the mercenary outfit that's fighting in Ukraine and Africa and elsewhere now. But I would argue that this man, from our world, all of us that are on the line today, when we deal with anti-money laundering and counter-threat finance, this guy is our number one. Probably not Prigozhin, Deripaska's. And he, like I said, he is deeply tied to New York. He's deeply tied to Florida. He's deeply tied to London. And we talk about some of the articles on here. What are some other things? I'm trying to look into this, Deb. It's kind of small, so you might be able to see it better than I.
Yeah, let me just add too that Deripaska has been involved. If you think that this is a big city problem, that's not the case, because we saw Deripaska in Kentucky investing in a small aluminum firm that was expanding. We've seen him touch every part of this country. So he is very prolific, and he does get tied into a lot of things, especially if it's connected, as Josh said, to the metals industry.
It's automotive industry, energy. It's almost amazing. It's almost amazing. So I don't know what systems you all use when you're doing your beneficial ownership analysis, but anytime you're dealing with Russia, it's kind of like the Kevin Bacon game, right? You can get to any Kevin Bacon with 6 actors. You can get to Deripaska and a couple actors almost all the time when dealing with Russia. Next slide, please. Okay, so, all right, I want to just kind of talk to this China piece. We talked a little bit about Russia today. China is the main emerging threat. Our world, as we know it, dealing with financial crime, dealing with fintech, dealing with transaction monitoring, investigations, what have you, is going to change dramatically in the next couple of years, dramatically. Just so you know, the most important company in the world is Taiwan Semiconductor Company. They're in Taiwan. They are a company, and I'm sure a lot of people know this from the news, but maybe don't fully understand it. They deal with semiconductors. Semiconductors go into everything from fighter jets to your smartphone to satellites. And it's not just that we need advanced semiconductors. We also need them built at scale because there are applications where we need thousands of these semiconductors. So we need millions and millions and millions and millions of them produced for all sorts of different things. Now, the significance of Taiwan Semiconductor Company is that they're an aggregator. So within that small chip are a whole bunch of different microcomponents. And those microcomponents come from different companies from different countries. So one might be from Japan, one microcomponent might be from South Korea, Belgium, the Netherlands, Australia, the United States. And each of those microcomponents have billions of dollars in intellectual property and emerging tech and research and development within that small microcomponent. And then they're put together into a single chip where this company is. Now, there's 2 things that I want to talk about from a China perspective. Number one is called rare earth elements. These are things like neodymium, dysprosium, lithium, cobalt. These are the precious minerals that go into things like semiconductors. The supply chain related to that is very important for our national security. It goes into everything from military hardware, emerging tech platforms, these semiconductors, you name it. We may go to war with China because of this company. Because if China were to seize these rare earth elements to the monopoly that they have, if they were to continue to do so, and they were to seize TSMC, they would probably win the great power competition, and the world would be on a fast track towards communism. That's how significant it is. Now, China's goal, because communism is expansionism, their goal is to expand through academia, through telecommunications infrastructure like Huawei and ZTE, because they want to control the information environment, and emerging technologies that are going to support their military structure. And as a result, why am I telling you this? You all work in AML and you work in big data. Why am I telling you this? Because the U.S. intelligence community sees these things that are threats and then tells the regulators how to regulate your banks, the banks that you work with. So we are seeing a shift away from again, a terrorism type environment right now towards predominantly a Russia focus and a lesser extent China focus, but it's coming down. Russia's going down and China's going up significantly. We also see that while Russia is kind of in the lead in terms of our sanctions regime, China is in the lead in terms of our export enforcement regime. We are focused on trying to prevent a large-scale war with China by preventing their certain military capabilities from exceeding ours because of how they're stealing intellectual property. So that's why those export enforcement controls are so important. That's why you need to SAR heavily and focus that into your risk assessments and your transaction monitoring models. Finally, the Chinese Communist Party is instrumentally involved in supporting transnational criminal organizations, Sinaloa cartel, Jalisco New Generation cartel in Mexico, which killed over 100,000 Americans last year. I think that's my last slide. Pending your questions, that's that in my portion.
Well, thank you for that detailed run through there, Josh. I wanted to bring in Deb and Clint. How does bringing it closer to what a lot of the people who are listening do for every day? How does ID verification play its role in stopping these types of activities, and what are some of the operational considerations that FIs and fintechs should be looking at? Maybe Deb, start with you, and then we'll bring Clint in.
Yeah, sure. I think, as Josh alluded to, there are situations where we're seeing some of these financial facilitators, and there are deficiencies both on the identity verification processes as well as the know your customer or customer due diligence processes that can lead to risk for your organization. So make sure that you are using your front end processes to be able to mitigate those risks for your organization. Things like not only screening out, are these people actually legitimate and real, but also other ways that you can use that to leverage in your sanctions program. I think Josh's point is around make sure that your program is comprehensive, includes not only your sanctions screening, your sanctions monitoring, which has to happen, right? Because this is such a fast moving environment, you have to do both, but also your CIP and your identity verification, your know your customer and your CDD processes. Those can all help you to distinguish and manage that risk. And the reason we're bringing all this detail to you is there are certain things that you should be looking for and make sure that you're aware of as you're building out your programs, right? Your risk assessment should include all of those things. And I'll let you add anything you'd like to, Clint.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is emphasizing what I've come to experience in the industry, which is this is real. This is information and things that we're monitoring for and attempting to identify have real world consequences, and they're not small. And so when you're inside of an organization that's you're responsible and charged with finding these things, you have to understand that you're going to have to deal with scale. The data is out there is massive. It's so many data points, which is amazing, but you've got a team that is smaller than the data. So you have to be able to scale that. You have to have a small team that can do big things. And so you need to work with and develop policies and procedures that also accommodate that. You also need to really accept at the end of the day, some of these things we're identifying will end up in a manual review state. So you're reviewing thousands and thousands of transactions, sometimes hundreds of thousands, and you can deal and come into things that are called false positives, false negatives. But when you have an OFAC hit or something in a sanctions area, a best practice and probably following your risk profiling procedures is to manually dig in and start to do what's called clearing them, which means you have to go through and literally look at all of them, identify where and when it might be right and where and when it might be wrong, document that so you can then show it to your examiners and regulators, show them that you've got policies that make sense. I think that leads into the next thing, which has really been a big part of some of my experiences at organizations, which is an audit trail. To be able to demonstrate and document what you've done, and so that you can show that you are on track and in line with what the federal regulators and state regulators have in mind for a best practice or for a bank, and then corresponding procedures. And that also brings in reporting. You need to be able to have in your systems and in your environment quick tools that will allow you to report on what's happened, what you did to accommodate or to mitigate that damage, and then how you're going to learn from that. In my experience with regulators, that's what they want to see. They want to see that you can learn from what's happened. And when you do that, they'll work well with you to make sure that you've got the tools that you need at a federal level to do that. I guess the last thing is, you can't know everything. And that's why I love sessions like this with Deb and with Josh, because that brings such a massive amount of information and expertise to all of us so that we can actually work in the smaller environments where we don't get that exposure, but we're the ones who are actually looking at the data and feeding that up to people like Josh and working with companies like Socure and Alloy so we can all do this in a way that makes it that we're working at it hard, but we're working at it smart.
This might be one of the more pointed and perfect questions for an audience that I think you're speaking to right now, which is, when it comes to fintechs, who is ultimately responsible for the risk? The fintech itself or the sponsor banks? As many fintechs who are listening in probably work with sponsor banks in some way and might be thinking, all right, well, this is on the bank and we use their charter. We use, the bank for a partnership. So it's on them. But is that the case? What should fintechs be thinking about?
Yeah, I'm going to go to you.
I think that obviously you have to work with your sponsor bank, right, as a fintech, and you have to follow their direction because they have policies that they have in place. They may be doing some things in the background. But what about the situation where you've got products that are not running through a sponsor bank? What about the case where you may have multiple sponsors? In that case, you want to make sure that you as an organization are protected as well, because the reality is that each and every country, each and every operator, even if I sold my car, right, to somebody who is on the OFAC list, I'm still going to be subject to fine. So you cannot leave everything to the sponsor bank or to a partner. You want to be able to manage and mitigate that risk on your own. So I think it's critically important that you have a solid program regardless of who's behind the scenes.
I think I want to add on to that also. Josh mentioned outcomes and that regulators focus on outcomes. If we look back to 9/11 and we look to outcomes and we go through the financial tracking of what was happened and where it happened, I don't think it would be ignored if you were in the outcome. If your organization was not a bank, but you were part of the trail. And that all that to say that it's not about checking boxes, it's about preventing real terror and real crime. And there are lots of examples of where we can do that if we're working that way. I'll also say this, as an organization that's not a bank, which is Alloy, we have a program where with our customers and with our vendors, we run them through OFAC because we as an organization are not going to, we're liable for who we do business with. And so are everybody else that's an organization. So there's lots of ways to check on this.
As a reminder to our audience, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom window, and you can pose those questions at any point, through the next 20 minutes as we continue our conversation here. We did have a question come in for you, Deb. Can Socure, and this is from David in our audience, can Socure provide solutions to mitigate risk while we are working from the exchange sector in Venezuela? knowing that the scandal with PDVSA crypto is one of the biggest in recent years?
Yeah, I'd probably have to get a little bit more detail around that, David. But I mean, there are things that we can do both on the real-time transactional side to be able to look at sanctions screening, and we certainly can work with the Alloy team on that as well. Alloy has the ability to do some transaction monitoring, so we can help you understand what your sanctions evasion risk might be on that side of the equation. So I think there's a number of areas that we can potentially help. Your point about crypto being, one of the biggest challenges certainly is true, and you want to look at those ingress egress points. So I think without getting too specific, I'd love to take that conversation offline as to how we could help you kind of mitigate those risks and shore that up. But I think there are some things that we could certainly help support you on.
Speaking of working together, Clint, maybe if you can tell us how you and Deb and the team at Socure do work together, and maybe give a real world example of kind of what that partnership looks like.
So Socure and Alloy have been working for some years together, and to understand the relationship, I think it is helpful. And I'll let Deb explain Socure, but I'll explain the Alloy side of it, which is Alloy has over 190 integrations with data partners. And what we do is allow your organization to continue to do the lifting, but when it's heavy lifting, we make it so that it's a little easier. We bring in things to scale. We have an interface that allows your teams to work quickly. We work hard to make sure that implementation is one that you're not focused on, but we're focused on making it so you can keep doing your day jobs and not add in layer after layer after layer. And through those integrations, we work to mitigate fraud, and because we believe that identity verification is a huge piece of sanction screening, because people are those that are committing the crimes. And so identity verification is a massive part of how that goes. And at Alloy, we work with Socure to do that. And I'll pause there to let Deb add in, how Socure does that, because she's obviously got great knowledge there.
Yeah, I mean, Socure is a provider that, Alloy provides a great orchestration layer to be able to enable a lot of these different solutions. That's always a challenge, right, within most organizations. But our role at Socure really is to help you understand and mitigate risk at the front end of how you onboard your clients, whether it's fraud risk, whether it's CIP or identity verification risk, whether it is sanctions or watch list. We also do ongoing monitoring of your sanction screening as you work through life cycle with your customers. And we also have some payments solution to be able to verify if a bank account actually belongs to somebody. So funding capabilities. So there are a number of things that we can help at different touch points throughout the life cycle as you work with your customers by deploying through the Alloy interface.
And I think one of the other things that has been mentioned a few times is a risk-based approach to finance. Because there's massive amounts of information and data, you have to make decisions, but you have to track those decisions. There needs to be rationale behind why you're moving a particular set or a particular customer into a high or a medium or low status. And one of those things you have to do is track that, document it. Document when your board of directors said, this is okay, we're okay with this written policy, and how you do it. Then you go and do it. And Alloy has infrastructure that allows you to identify how and when that risk happened and how it's tracked. And a lot of that then goes into SAR reporting, which is another massive, Josh mentioned that, I think Deb did as well. That's how we get information to the people who are going to be impacting and handling it in the real world on the government law enforcement side. And that's something that is actually is really important to me personally, because I've seen in my position at banks, the real crimes that can be prevented, and then the real crimes that weren't, and they happen to real people. And it's something that if we all really focus and take and use the information that's available and do our jobs well in a concise way, we can make things, we can make the world better. Right? It sounds a little,
it sounds a little trite, but it's absolutely true. Yeah, I know Josh and I have worked a number of cases together in which we've seen the human cost, right, the human toll. There's a lot of attitude that money laundering doesn't hurt anybody, right? But it really does, because that predicate source of funds, whether it's human trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, any number of illegal activities, it can be fraud. All of those things are hurting somebody else. They're taking something away. They are infringing upon another human life. So that is the real toll of this. It's not just about moving funds. And I think that is important to remember. I think, Josh, you and I have had these conversations all over the world with audiences, and I think it's definitely something we have to keep into scope, because it's easy to get numb at looking at numbers on a page.
Well, it's also
And
looking at large numbers. Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
No, and that's why it probably sounded like I was yelling my whole presentation, because of that very reason. Deb and I have worked some like absolutely incredible, massive cases, from human trafficking to sanctions evasion to cartels, terrorist groups. And I would agree with Deb. I think money laundering is the primary enabling or facilitating mechanism used to exploit human rights around the world. I think that's a good way to put it.
And I think you talk about the massive numbers, and it's important to do so. You talk about small dollar transactions that facilitate horrific crimes. I recently looked at the dollars that it costs to put this human being, and it's a small dollar amount. And if you can take action that stops a little bit of that, much of which happens in the US, I think we can do that. And anti-money laundering is, I think, where it's at. I mean, money has congealed life. If we can stop them from using it in a way that's wrong, we can stop a lot of it.
Absolutely right. So I want to go back to, Josh, the so what, as far as some of the things that you're talking about. I think it's a lot of information, but from a risk perspective, how would you suggest that our audience start to kind of scope some of this into their programs and take a look at this from their lens?
I mean, obviously having a good relationship with your regulators, right? I've always believed in industry that we want to build diverse teams. We need people that have a traditional financial services background. We need technology people. We need people that have strong international affairs backgrounds, intelligence community, national security backgrounds, because we need to be able to capitalize on this very detailed and monotonous understanding of international affairs. Because it's not just what countries are having conflicts with one another. It's getting into specific lines of effort, like semiconductors, for example, being able to dive in at that level and essentially build out an organizational risk footprint, a risk-based model that we've always called the core four. And that is that we've always called kind of your inherent risk environment. Your inherent risk environment is essentially your core four as a financial institution. What does my customer base look like? What do their counterparties look like? What is the geographic nexus by which we provide product offerings? And what are those products? Because each of those four dimensions provide the opportunity to be exploited by different state and non-state actors. And I agree with other speakers in terms of, we still have small value transactions that perpetrate other actions. Just because we're shifting towards more of a great power approach does not mean criminal activity, drugs, human trafficking, terrorism doesn't matter. It just means that there's additional resource allocation to other lines of effort. So I agree with that. In terms of kind of the counterpoint of that, what we would call the inherent risk environment, those core four attributes that we look at to formulate our own risk-based approach within financial services, it is a compare and contrast of who we are as an FI, our customers, counterparties, geography, and products and instruments, versus what we would call the GTL, or the global threat landscape. This is relatively static in time. The global threat landscape as it is, the state and non-state actors involved, the nature of their interdependence on one another, the hybrid threat nexus between those hostile state and non-state actors, we call that hybrid threat finance. It's the idea that these bad actors, these terrorists, these cartels, these Russia, China, Iran, they are inherently interconnected, not just on a diplomatic level. They're inherently interconnected on a financial level. And it's that line of business within their operations that we are targeting. We're targeting that financial facilitation apparatus, that ability to sustain their ongoing operations that are hostile to the United States and human rights. So where rubber meets the road here is where the threat landscape, which again is relatively static at any given time and changes slowly, believe it or not, unless it's like a Russian invasion of Ukraine type major incident that kind of changes the status quo. Generally speaking, it's static. How do we compare that risk-based approach of what the world of risk looks like with our inherent risk environment? And then how do we go about from the data parsing, the attribute analysis, everything that we need to do to make sure that we're looking at the right criteria so that we can start to build transaction monitoring, a transaction monitoring regime of detection models that aren't just action-based. Are you just looking at structuring and flow through of funds, or are you incorporating an understanding of the risk in the world around you as it pertains to the core 4 attributes of your financial institution? And if you're a fintech supporting that FI, are you thinking about it that way? Or are you just looking at out-of-the-box rules and how to modify that data? Again, if you want to be the very best in this industry, there are echelons to the game, not 1 or 2 or 3, probably 10. And to get to that very, very high level, you have to be able to incorporate both the qualitative and the quantitative, the international affairs and international business and economic statecraft element with how do we quantify that in data? And I'm sorry if I went on.
Oh, that's great.
Deb, I'd love if you could, as we pull up a summary slide here, maybe just give some key wrap-up takeaways from our time here, and to the audience, if you have any questions, we ask that you input them now. We've answered a few already, but we'd love to get a few more and be happy to answer those. Deb, I'll turn it over to you in terms of review of what we've discussed here today.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. I think as Josh pointed out, when you're doing your risk assessment, there's a lot of things that you need to be aware of. And when we're talking about sanctions, there is increased scrutiny from regulators. There's increased scrutiny across the board, right, because of illicit finance that is happening. And you want to make sure that you understand, as Josh pointed out, some of the industries, some of the mechanisms, some of the things that are occurring, and make sure that you understand if they're occurring within your organization so that you can scope those into your risk assessment. There are severe consequences, right? If you're not doing things like monitoring your transactions or your customer base, right, for ongoing sanctions, that's a gap. And willful noncompliance carries $1 million per violation fine, right? Those are big things. So you want to make sure that you've identified those things. And at the end of the day, it's all about protecting the charter. Whether you're in a fintech who by extension of your agreement with your sponsor bank is involved in a charter, it's all about that. From a best practices perspective, make sure your sanctions lists are constantly up to date, that they're refreshed on an ongoing basis, that you're screening at every onboarding, and also I would add at every high risk point, right? So if somebody is doing a large transaction or a large transfer, that you're screening at that point as well. Also, we want to make sure that there is continuous monitoring. There are a lot of solutions out there where you can upload a batch, and you have to have an IT function, right, as you update your sanctions. But continuous monitoring really is a way to be able to put that into autopilot and reduce some of the IT impacts and some of the internal resource constraints that you may be dealing with, and also account for multi-jurisdictional considerations. If you've got the ability to transfer overseas, if you've got a number of different things in your organization, make sure that you have scoped those and accounted for those in your overall program and in your processes. I think there are a lot of tools that you have within your entire ecosystem. We talked a little bit about identity verification. I think that's another good tool. Fraud mitigation tools, all can be things that you bring to bear as you build out your program and continue to mitigate risk and make sure that you are covering all the things that Josh talked about today.
Deb, can I caveat one thing?
Yep.
Ask yourselves as well, is there an interoperability communication function here between the sanction screening apparatus, the transaction monitoring apparatus from a technical standpoint, and the end user function of investigations and KYC? Is there interoperability there? If you have risk in that sanctions component, are you talking to each other? And I think that's important.
No, good point. Taking away some of those silos is always important, and I would add to that, and I think you touched on it earlier, is having those conversations with your regulatory authority, whether it's a sponsor bank, they're your partner, right? Or if it's a prudential regulator, make sure that you are engaged with those organizations, because they can really help you understand what's coming and where there's risks that might be happening across the ecosystem.
Well, I think a tool that helps you do that efficiently is ideal and necessary, because you can then focus on the investigations and getting to Josh and others the narratives and the information they need.
We're getting close to wrap time here. I'm going to launch a quick poll for our audience. If you could take a minute there and answer that. But we did have a final question come in here from the audience, which is, what is a normal hit rate that I can expect on my sanctions program?
I would tell you that is dependent really on what your population looks like. But when it comes to things like sanctions, government sponsored sanction lists like OFAC, typically we see basis points, right? It should be a fairly small hit rate. 20 basis points might be an average that you could shoot for, but there are variables obviously that will change that. But if you are getting higher than a percentage point, I would be looking at tuning and making sure that you've got the appropriate alignment. Make sure that you're constantly testing your settings to assure that you're constantly evolving with your risk, and that you're doing everything that you can to manage both the hit rates and the quality of your hits, right? So you want to do the quantitative and qualitative analysis.
Well, I want to thank Deb, Clint, Josh for your time. Obviously, thank you to our audience, as always, for your time and your questions. Special thanks to the team at Socure for their continued support. And as one of our attendees said, thank you very much for telling us why sanctions are important, not just talking about actual sanctions. And that was from Matthew in our audience, which I think is a good place to end. Thanks again, Josh, Clint, and Deb. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.